In this video, I'll tell you about a series of tragic events that left ordinary people face to face with an inevitable end. So, viewer discretion is advised. On March 1st, 2024, Sydney was driving her work truck across the Clark Memorial Bridge near Louisville. At the same time, 33-year-old Trevor Branham, whose license had recently been revoked, was maneuvering around a stalled car when he swerved into oncoming traffic. He crashed into the truck, a sedan, and finally, a semi. Meanwhile, Sydney, after narrowly avoiding the accident, was left dangling over the river, inches from the fatal outcome. She pressed the brake pedal as hard as she could, frozen in place, terrified that any moment would send her plunging into the depths. Even if she survived the fall, she would certainly drown because she couldn't swim. Every minute felt like an eternity to Sydney, and 40 minutes passed before help finally arrived. It was a dangerous, extremely complicated rescue operation. But thankfully, disaster was avoided and Sydney was eventually saved. As for Branham, the pickup driver, he now faces a list of charges and will answer in court. At least he won't be charged with involuntary manslaughter. Sydney, though, vowed never to cross that cursed bridge again. Unfortunately, not everyone is as lucky when it comes to learning from close calls. Wu Bin, a Chinese resident, had almost a decade of experience as a long-distance passenger bus driver. He'd logged nearly 1 million kilometers without a single accident or complaint from passengers. That's about 25 times around the Earth's equator. However, on May 29, 2012, Wu Bin became a true hero. As usual, he was driving his bus when passengers suddenly heard a loud crash. Wu slowly brought the bus to a stop and addressed the people inside. But they noticed he was deathly pale and barely standing. Wu instructed everyone to carefully exit the bus and then fell silent. What the passengers hadn't seen was that, just moments earlier, a massive piece of debris had crashed through the windshield, hitting Wu in the stomach and arms. It was a nearly 2-meter-long metal plate that shattered Wu's ribs and shredded his liver. Despite the excruciating pain, he saved the lives of 24 passengers by managing to safely stop the bus. Sadly, Wu passed away 4 days later in the hospital. It turned out the metal piece that had so suddenly struck him was part of a truck's brake pad. While the police conducted their investigation, news of Wu Bin's heroic actions spread throughout the country. About 3,000 people attended his funeral to pay their respects. He was posthumously awarded the highest national honor. But this sacrifice wouldn't have been necessary had someone taken better care of their vehicle, much like the catastrophic event that struck in Fort Lauderdale. On December 1st, 2018, life in the town was going on as usual. Eladio Marquez, a pilot and instructor with 10 years of experience, and his former student were preparing for another flight. They took off in their small Cessna, but just a few minutes later, they reported some alarming news to the control tower. Their left engine had caught fire. Marquez received clearance for an emergency landing, but that landing never happened. A minute later, the plane crashed and exploded, hitting none other than a therapy center for children with autism. It was 2:22 p.m. when all 8 caregivers and 5 children heard the terrifying sound of the impact. The teachers managed to grab the kids and rush them to the exit just seconds before the flames engulfed the building. Thanks to their quick reaction, no one in the center was harmed. The police launched an investigation, but it seemed like the malfunctioning engine hadn't been given enough attention in the hangar. However, the chilling truth is that you don't have to be in a plane crash to meet a tragic end. British woman Elena Struthers-Gardner had experienced 2 fatal falls in her life. At 21, she fell from a horse, sustaining a severe injury that left her disabled. From then on, due to her spinal deformity and coordination issues, she fell often. But despite this, Elena lived happily with her wife, Mandy, until she turned 60. Then, on November 22, 2018, Elena was at home drinking from her favorite glass with a metal straw. Mandy had always warned her to be careful, suspecting that these straws could be dangerous for people with limited mobility. And unfortunately, her fears came true. Out of nowhere, Elena lost her balance and fell, and the 8-inch metal straw went straight into her eye. She sustained a severe traumatic brain injury and passed away the next day in the hospital. This is especially terrifying because no one is safe from such fatal accidents. Sometimes, though, tragedy strikes when everything seems to be going perfectly. 23-year-old Peter Bioksongzuala had never been more nervous. His team, Bethlehem Vangthlang, part of an elite Indian amateur league, was about to take a free kick. In the 62nd minute, his teammate finally took the penalty shot, but when the goalkeeper deflected the ball, Peter dashed in for the rebound and scored. He immediately began celebrating with a series of victory flips. Yet after the second flip, he landed awkwardly, hit his head on the ground, and couldn't get back up. His teammates rushed over, quickly realizing something was terribly wrong. At the hospital, it was revealed that Peter had severely damaged his spinal cord. And despite the doctor's best efforts, Peter passed away later that day. This absurd tragedy confirmed that danger can literally be lurking right beneath our feet. This could have easily been the beginning of a horror movie. 83-year-old Dorothy Louise Downey arrived at a creepy old house on the edge of the woods in Salem. In reality, though, she was just there to help her daughter pack up and finally move out of the rundown place. However, while in the kitchen, Dorothy accidentally stepped on a rotten section of the floor and fell through, disappearing completely beneath it. Her daughter rushed to help, only to be stunned by what she saw. Under the floor was a well, nearly 15 meters deep. She couldn't do anything to save her mother and called the rescue team. Even they needed 4 hours to recover Dorothy's lifeless body from the narrow well. Neither mother nor daughter had any idea the deadly shaft existed, and it claimed Dorothy's life just as she was visiting the house for the last time. This coincidence feels like the result of some curse, just like the next story. On the night of March 26, 2024, 6 construction workers were doing scheduled repairs on the Francis Scott Key Bridge near Baltimore. Meanwhile, a nearly 300-meter container ship, the Dolly, had just left the port of Baltimore, heading for Sri Lanka. There were 21 crew members on board, all eager to finally go home, especially since the day before, the Dolly had started experiencing sudden electrical failures. And at exactly 1:24 a.m., as the ship approached the Francis Scott Key Bridge, the power went out again, the engines stopped, and the massive vessel began drifting with the current. The crew desperately tried to restore power and correct the course. The power came back exactly a minute later, but by then, the Dolly was dangerously close to one of the bridge's supports. The crew immediately warned the authorities that a disaster was imminent. The police managed to close the bridge to traffic just in time before the Dolly collided with the support. In just 20 seconds, the central arch of the bridge was gone. But no one had time to warn the 6 workers who suddenly found themselves trapped between tons of twisted metal and concrete. Now, plunging into the river's fast-moving current, rescue teams arrived quickly. But in the dead of night, with zero visibility, they couldn't do much. It wasn't until dawn that the true scale of the catastrophe became clear. One of the largest shipping channels in the U.S. was now completely blocked, leading to nearly $3 billion in damages. However, the most horrifying part was that none of the workers survived. The last body was found and recovered by divers 6 weeks later. All 6 men were first-generation immigrants, hoping to achieve their American dream, and almost every one of them was a father of multiple children. Meanwhile, the Dolly crew remained unharmed. But for the rest of their lives, they'll know that if someone had insisted on fixing that faulty electrical system, those 6 workers would still be alive. And a psychological torment can often be just as horrifying as physical pain. On January 2nd, 2024, Japanese woman Mika Yamaki was driving to the airport to pick up her husband. She was listening to the news on the radio when she suddenly heard that a disaster had occurred at the airport. And in the report, they mentioned the exact flight her husband was on. Just minutes earlier, Flight 516, arriving from Sapporo, had requested permission to land at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. The controllers confirmed the landing, and the pilots guided the Airbus with its 379 passengers onto the runway. At 5:46 p.m. local time, Flight 516 touched down. Seconds later, the plane unexpectedly burst into flames, sending a massive fireball into the sky. The Airbus continued to slide down the runway, leaving a trail of fire and thick smoke behind. It was only then that the passengers realized something had gone horribly wrong. The cabin started filling with toxic smoke, and the flight attendants called for an emergency evacuation. Meanwhile, panic-stricken Mika Yamaki started calling her husband, and he answered. He was among the first to escape the inferno using the emergency slide. The rest of the passengers followed, while firefighters had already begun battling the flames. But as the minutes ticked by, the fire consumed more and more of the plane, requiring over 100 fire trucks to be deployed. And that wasn't all. Soon, the cause of the fire was revealed. It turned out that the massive Airbus had collided with a tiny Coast Guard plane during landing, and both aircraft instantly caught fire. When terrified Mika finally arrived at the airport, she learned that her husband was safe, as were the rest of the passengers and crew of Flight 516. Tragically, 5 of the 6 people on the Coast Guard plane died on the spot. Only the captain survived, but he was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The investigation revealed that the disaster was caused by several factors. First, the Coast Guard pilot either didn't hear or didn't understand the controller's instruction to stay off the runway. Second, he turned off his radio to switch to another channel, missing the clearance for Flight 516 to land. And third, the airport was overwhelmed by the New Year holiday rush, and there wasn't enough staff to monitor everything. When employers or employees do their jobs poorly, countless innocent lives can be at risk. On December 24, 2022, a truck set off from Richards Bay, South Africa, to Botswana, carrying a tanker with 60,000 liters of liquefied petroleum gas. However, on Christmas Eve, the driver mistakenly took a wrong turn and ended up in Boksburg. He was trying to get back en route when he came upon a tunnel under a railway crossing. What happened next will remain a mystery forever. Whether the driver didn't notice the height restriction sign or if it wasn't there at all, the truck got stuck right in the middle of the bridge. But that was far from his biggest problem, as within seconds he heard a hissing sound and smelled gas. The man immediately called an ambulance, feeling dizzy from the toxic fumes, and called the firefighters, fearing the tanker might ignite at any moment. But they didn't make it in time, and at 6:45 a.m., the gas exploded. When the fire engulfed everything around, 2 smaller explosions followed. They were clearly heard in the nearby houses and buildings, prompting locals to come out and see what had happened. Among them was 26-year-old Numitso Mashaba, who lived just 100 meters from the crossing. He left his children with his father in the house and rushed to make sure his wife Neo and his brother were okay. Dozens of people gathered around the flaming crossing when suddenly the 4th and most powerful explosion occurred. Everyone standing near the tanker was thrown back by the fireball. Their clothes instantly melted onto their bodies, and no one could get up again. The explosion destroyed the railway crossing, the fire truck trying to contain the flames, and several nearby homes and vehicles. The tanker detonated with such force that even a nearby hospital was reduced to ruins. 13 of its employees and 24 patients suffered severe injuries and burns. 8 medical workers and the driver in the hospital parking lot were killed. The Mashaba couple didn't survive either, and in the days following the disaster, the death toll rose to 41. Moreover, 2 people who were at the epicenter of the explosion are still considered missing. This gruesome reminder shows that even observing such accidents from a distance can be dangerous, and it's best to stay far away. Authorities were unable to determine who was to blame. Unfortunately, in many cases like this, those responsible avoid punishment, even if their mistakes have claimed dozens of lives. On the evening of July 2nd, 2024, a fenced-off, swampy area in the Hathras district of India was almost empty. Just hours earlier, the scene of an event shocked the world. It began as a typical Hindu prayer gathering. Local guru, Bola Baba, organized an assembly of his followers. He received official permission to host an event for 5,000 people. However, his followers numbered in the tens of thousands, and as a result, the area became tightly packed with people. This was despite the 38°C heat. Entire families, including many women and children, stood there all day to listen to the guru's sermon. But the heat and suffocating conditions turned into a living hell. When the sermon ended and thousands of people surged toward the guru, trying to touch him, the volunteer guards couldn't calm the crowd, and visitors began literally trampling each other. Those who tripped had no chance of getting up and were trampled to death. Moreover, due to the intense pressure, even those still standing were suffocating because their lungs had no room to expand. When the crowd finally thinned out, the ground was littered with bodies. It took a long time to identify them all, but it was eventually revealed that 116 people perished in the stampede, the vast majority of whom were women and children. Unfortunately, deadly stampedes during religious pilgrimages happen all too often in India, yet it seems as though no one truly takes action. These tragedies could be avoided if people recognized the risks of mass gatherings in time and left before disaster struck. Let's hope these tragic events only live on in the videos on my channel.